What's up, folks? Now, one thing that should come as no surprise is the Bay Area's tolerance for these mind-altering, mind-expanding substances. Whether it was Allen Ginsberg and the Beat Poets toking some reefer while hitting up a jazz show at the Black Hawk, or the Haight-Ashbury hippies meandering down the street after munching on some psychedelic mushrooms, the bottom line is, Bay Area residents, all knowing, let their neighbors, how can I say it better than make their own choices. And today, I choose to talk about the guy who was the legendary LSD chemist and former sound engineer for the Grateful Dead. That's right, you know it. Today we're talking and visiting the sites, talking about the man, the myth, the legend, Augustus Owsley Stanley III, AKA Bear. So buckle up, because today we're going to visit some of Owsley's legendary spots. And let me tell you, these are the places where he wasn't just brewing up a batch of your typical backyard moonshine. Not at all. Rather, he was crafting some of the purest, most mind-bending LSD ever, earning him the highly coveted nickname, the King of Acid. I'm talking about the kind of acid that made you see colors that you didn't even know existed. And Owsley, he just didn't dabble in the stuff. He was like the Willy Wonka of psychedelics, cranking out batches of Owsley acid that fueled the summer of love and basically made San Francisco the epicenter of the universe for one hot moment. So, let's do this, folks. Let's kick the tires and light the fires and get this episode of Bay Area Babylon
started.
Born in 1935, Owsley Augustus Stanley III didn't just think outside the box. He tore it apart, turned it into confetti, and threw a party with it. I mean, this guy was a real trip, pun intended. Owsley had the starring role in the 1960s counterculture scene, right here in the Bay Area. But let me tell you, Owsley didn't follow in the footsteps of his well-respected political family from Kentucky. Not at all.
Not even close.
He was the black sheep of the family, a real rebel with a cause. I mean, this was the guy your grandma warned you about. If your grandma, was into LSD, free love, and all that stuff, that is. And even though academics came very easy for young Augustus, he still spent 15 months as a voluntary patient in a psychiatric hospital when he was just a teenager. He then got out and went to Berkeley, where I'm stand at right now. He was here at Berkeley for about, maybe a semester before deciding that this whole school thing just wasn't for him. So he went full throttle into a more profitable business, that of making and selling LSD. And where exactly did Owsley make his fine product? Well, since you asked, right here in fact, at 1647 Virginia Street, right in the house behind me. Now this might look like an ordinary, everyday house to us here today, but back in the late 1960s, it was infamously known as the Green Factory. And from inside the house, Owsley cranked out enough doses of acid to wipe out an entire squadron of rabid vampires. Owsley's reputation for the LSD he was producing spread far and wide, so much so that local authorities didn't blink when they caught wind that he was actually keeping a makeshift drug lab right inside the bathroom of this house right here. Now, it also wasn't surprising when the house got raided by the cops and Owsley ended up busted. But what was surprising was when he ended up beating the case and successfully sued the police for the return of his drug-making equipment. You see, police were looking for methamphetamine production, but they only found LSD inside the house here, which at the time was still very much legal. Now, while Owsley stayed busy making acid and doing his best to avoid the fuzz, there was another character who busied himself, steering the ship of the Bay Area's counterculture movement. He was an author, an acid evangelist, and he was a guy by the name of Kesey. Now Kesey, who I discussed in a separate video, where I actually go to his former house up in the La Honda Redwoods, well, this dude was like the patron saint of the emerging acid culture. So much so that he and a group of friends of his and lovers, known as the Merry Pranksters, traveled across the United States in an old psychedelic school bus that they called Further, tripping their faces off and documenting the weird scenes as they encountered them along the way. So when Owsley caught wind that Kesey was, holding these far-out psychedelic acid-dropping parties known as the acid tests, let's just say Owsley became
intrigued.
He became even more intrigued when he heard this insane music and strange noises reverberating out of the guitar of the acid tests house band. And that guitar, that guitar that was making all these distorted melodic sounds just happened to be being played by none other than Jerry Garcia himself. Now Owsley, who was more commonly known as Bear, due to the large amount of body hair covering his body, well, he befriended Jerry Garcia and his band, the Grateful Dead. And before he knew it, he'd become their sound engineer, and of course, their main supplier of LSD. Bear was meticulous, almost compulsive as a sound engineer, sometimes spending hours just tuning guitars and rewiring these complicated electrical circuits to get the right sound. Now before long, Bear began bankrolling the Grateful Dead with his drug money. He bought the Dead new equipment, he paid for their rent, he helped get them basically from one gig to the next, all the while keeping the microphones lined up correctly so the band sounded spectacular during their live performances. But Bear, see, he brought even much more to the legacy of the Grateful Dead. Because once, while driving the equipment up to the band's warehouse in Novato, he saw this large billboard on the side of the road with a circle with a dividing line coming through the center. The image stuck with Bear so much that he re-envisioned it as a skeleton skull with a lightning bolt coming down through the center. Look familiar? In fact, both Owsley and artist Bob Thomas liked the image so much that they began putting it on the band's equipment cases, to keep them from getting mixed up with other bands' equipment and backstage drama, during a gig. And before long, the 13-point lightning bolt skull became the official symbol of the Grateful Dead. But you, my friends, know better as the Steal Your Face icon, or just Steely, if you're in the know. And to this very day, it remains one of the most recognizable logos in all of the world. Now let's jump over to our next stop on the hippie highway. Now after the bust over at the Green Factory, Owsley had to find a new pad, one that would allow him the privacy that he needed to create new batches of his bathtub LSD. And the place he found was right here, 2321 Valley Street in Berkeley. But to Bear and his friends, this place was affectionately known as the Troll House. But be aware, this is no ordinary house, because inside, it was a hippie heaven. Persian rugs littered the floors, while Tibetan wall hangings covered every single wall in sight. Overstuffed furniture sat in every room while strobe lights flickered incessantly. And of course, there were instruments of all shapes and sizes, strewn all over the house. Now Owsley, who was undoubtedly a genius who lived life on his own terms, folks. For instance, he was a former professional ballet dancer. He ate an all-meat diet. He took these long one-hour showers and kept a pet owl living here at the Troll House, who he named Screech, all while cranking out hundreds of thousands of tabs of LSD right inside that front door there. But you see, the high times didn't last long for the king of LSD, because in 1967, Bear was once again arrested, but this time being caught with 350,000 hits of LSD and 1,500 hits of STP over at his drug lab in Orinda, about 10 miles east from where I stand. Bear believed in the power of hallucinogenics so much that he told the arresting officer that he was, quote, missing the boat, not trying the drug himself. Bear was arrested again, this time on January 31st, 1970. But this time the arrest took place at the Royal Sonesta Inn, down on Bourbon Street in New Orleans. After the Grateful Dead Fleetwood Mac show got done performing there at the famous Warehouse concert venue. Bear and all the members of the Dead, except for Pigpen and Tom Constantin, well, they were famously busted by the NOPD. The band's heavy vibes of getting busted would go on to be forever immortalized in their song, Truckin'. But you see, Bear's good fortune didn't last long, because later that year, he was sentenced to serve time at the infamous Terminal Island Prison down in Southern California, where he was incarcerated from 1970 to 1972. And believe it or not, in 1971, while Owsley was serving his time there, the Grateful Dead actually played a free concert at Terminal Island, which allowed Bear a chance to do what he loved best, making the Grateful Dead sound magnificent. And that's exactly what he did upon his release from prison. Bear wasted no time and went back out on the road with the Dead, setting up the band's sound equipment for their infamous 1972 tour. Never fully content with the band's sound during their live performances, in 1974, Bear designed and constructed the infamous Wall of Sound amplifier system. Now, the Wall of Sound that he created, it stood more than 3 stories tall and held over 600 speakers. It was an engineering colossus made up of wood, metal, and all sorts of wires. It was an audio setup so wild it looked like the Death Star had mated with a stack of amplifiers. All right, let me break this down for you cats and kittens. This megaton sound system was like completely free of distortion and can change the game of sound engineering. It was like he handed the sound engineers a magic wand and said, "Here you go, boys, go fix your problems with this." Owsley basically handed all the other sound engineers the rule books of how it's done. Let me tell you, the wall of sound was something else. And like Dr. Frankenstein and his monster, Bear was completely captivated with his creation. There was this one time that Mickey Hart, drummer for the Dead, heard Bear having a full-on heart-to-heart conversation with the speakers, just standing there saying, "I love you, and you love me. How could you ever let me down?" End quote. Now you might think that Owsley's story ends right there, but it doesn't. Owsley also created something called the Sonic Journals. Stanley was known for his innovative work in live sound recording and his role in creating some of the earliest high-fidelity live concert recordings. His Sonic Journals, well, they include recordings of concerts that were not initially made available to the public, and they offer a unique, authentic listening experience of the music scene from that era. These recordings are highly valued by fans and collectors of the historical and musical significance, providing a window into the live performances of one of the most iconic bands of all times, the Grateful Dead. In his later years, Owsley left the United States and settled in the remote, serene landscapes of far north Queensland, Australia. It was a place far from the chaos of the past, a stark contrast to the days when he was the Grateful Dead sound engineer and the man responsible for producing the most potent LSD in the 1960s. Owsley, ever the iconoclast, spent 3 years continuing his deep interest in nutrition and health. He always advocated for a high-fat, meat-centered diet that he believed was the key to human longevity and well-being. Owsley lived a relatively low-profile life in Australia with his wife Sheila, focusing on his artistic endeavors, including creating intricate jewelry, which was a lifelong passion for the man. Despite being physically distant from the music scene he once profoundly influenced, his legacy remained firmly intertwined with the counterculture that defined the 1960s. Sadly, on March 12, 2011, Owsley's life came to a tragic and unexpected end. He was driving along the Bruce Highway near his home in Australia when his vehicle skidded off the road on the wet pavement and crashed and killed him instantly. He was 76 years old. The accident shocked those who knew him and those who admired him from afar, as Owsley had always seemed larger than life, an almost mythical kind of figure who had survived the excesses of the 1960s. Now, Owsley Stanley's death marked the end of an era, at least for many people. He was one of the last remaining links to the original psychedelic movement, a man whose contributions to the music and culture were as significant as they were unconventional. Owsley's work with the Grateful Dead, particularly his innovations in sound engineering, it left a deep impact on the music industry, while the production of his LSD shaped the experiences of the counterculture generation as a whole. From supplying LSD to the Beatles, to engineering one of the most mind-bending, eardrum-blasting sound systems ever, Owsley Stanley's mark on music, tech, and just the cultural vibe of his time is still very much relevant today. Hey y'all, if you're still itching for some wacky, wild tales of the 1960s, back when counterculture was king and LSD was basically its own food group, then do yourself a favor and get over to the library and check out a copy of my book pick for this episode, The Most Dangerous Man in America by Stephen Davis and Bill Minutaglio. And just to clarify, no, this book isn't about a mob boss, a spy, or even a guy with a creepy, suspicious mustache running the rides at the small town carnival. This book here is all about the man, the myth, the legend, Mr. Timothy Leary, ultimate psychedelic escape artist. More specifically, this book here is about Timothy Leary's epic game of hide and seek with none other than President Richard Milhous Nixon, a guy who was so paranoid he probably thought his own dog was spying on him. So the book here, well, kicks off with old Timothy Leary who's a former Harvard professor turned LSD guru, deciding that the old prison life just isn't for him, so he needs to hatch an escape plan. I mean, who hasn't been there, right? So in 1970, Leary escapes from a California prison down in San Luis Obispo, but he couldn't do it alone. He had the help from a bunch of surfers turned smugglers called the Brotherhood of Eternal Love. Because, as a rule of thumb, when you're plotting a jailbreak, you always call the guys with the coolest names possible. Well, the Brotherhood here, they hired a group of these militants called the Weathermen to help break old Timmy out of the hoosegow for a cool $25K, which back in 1970 was a ton of dough. You see, because of his love of nature, Leary had been assigned to work as the gardener, which allowed him to be outside the prison buildings and much closer to the perimeter fence. Using a makeshift rope constructed out of telephone wire, Leary was able to scale up and over the prison fence. And once on the other side, Tim Leary was met by his accomplices from the Weathermen, who quickly whisked him away in their getaway car. From there, he was taken to a safe house where he was given a fake ID and a disguise to help him avoid detection. The Weathermen then arranged for Tim Leary and his wife Rosemary to be smuggled out of the United States altogether. Now, after catching wind of the escape, Richard Nixon pretty much starts sweating bullets over there in the Oval Office. Meanwhile, Leary goes on this international fugitive tour, and the story reads like someone let Hunter S. Thompson loose in a history book. Leary's dodging the feds like it's a Benny Hill sketch, hanging out with Black Panthers and partying with these European aristocrats. At one point, he's in Algeria under the protection of all people, Eldridge Cleaver. You know, just your average Tuesday for the guy who invented the phrase, turn on, tune in, and drop out. Minutaglio and Davis, the authors, they do a bang-up job of painting Leary and Nixon as two dudes who really need to chill, but for completely different reasons. Leary's all like, hey, expand your mind, man, while Nixon's like, expand your prison cells. It's like the ultimate odd couple showdown. If Felix and Arthur were both on a government watch list, that is. Now, the book here itself reads like a cross between a political thriller and an acid trip, and I mean that in the best way possible. The authors bounce readers back and forth between Leary's madcap adventures and Nixon's complete meltdown like a ping pong match going back and forth on speed. It's a wild, wild ride, and you can practically hear Nixon's jowls flapping in rage with every page turn. But don't be fooled here, folks, because this book just isn't about a guy who liked to do psychedelics and a president who probably should have done them himself. It's about two forces of nature colliding in the most hilariously mismatched way possible. Leary, the eternal trickster, somehow convinces everyone around him that he's always just one step away from enlightenment, while Nixon's losing his mind over the idea that there might be some hippie out there that he hasn't yet thrown in jail. This book is a chaotic, colorful, wild ride, and it's a hell of a lot of fun. So if you're looking for a thrilling, laugh-out-loud romp through one of the weirdest showdowns in American history, The Most Dangerous Man in America has got you covered. Just be prepared. By the end, you just might feel like you've been on a trip yourself. Minus the munchies, and of course the urge to play the sitar. And if your local library doesn't carry this book, talk to the reference librarian about placing an interlibrary loan. And that just means you're getting the book from a different library system. Thanks for hanging out with me out here on the Wild West Coast, where every day is a Technicolor daydream. Well, more like a Technicolor traffic jam. But it's definitely a place where you can just live and be yourself. I'll catch you all on the flip side. We'll see you down the hippie highway on our next episode, out here in this Bay Area Babylon.